Hey, it's Antoinette Lattouf with the weekend briefing. And I think it's fair to say that most political leaders, once they retire from politics, are happy to retreat from public life, but not the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. He's been happy to share his opinions since he stepped down from the top job. It's season 3 now of his podcast, Defending Democracy. We talk about the state of democracy. We talk about his leadership and whether he likes it or not. It ends up that Malcolm has to defend some of his views because, I am who I am. Mr. Turnbull, welcome to the weekend briefing. I want to start off by asking what you do in your spare time. Like, who is Malcolm at home? Because rarely do we get an insight into the ordinary things, or, perhaps you like to make sourdough bread, which happened to everybody during COVID. Like, what do you do when you're not being in the public eye?
Well, I talk to my wife, Lucy,
Oh,
and
that's good to know.
Yeah, we go for walks, and we do a lot of things together. We're very good friends, so I spend a lot of time with Lucy and our grandchildren. We've got 4 grandchildren, 2 of whom live in Sydney, 2 in Singapore. So we see the Sydney ones, frequently.
Yeah.
And I go kayaking and do all sorts of things. Yeah, I'm just I read a lot. Yeah, I'm just nothing terribly remarkable.
So the new UK Prime Minister has said he wants to take Friday evenings off. Like, how realistic is it for a leader of a nation like the UK or even Australia to think that they're really going to get any nights off?
Well,
Or to think he can schedule a night off?
Well, look, his wife is Jewish, and the kids have been brought up in the Jewish
right.
faith, and so that Jewish people
Shabbat.
have a dinner seder on Friday nights, the beginning of their Sabbath, and that's a tradition, and it's whether you subscribe to Judaism or not, it's a nice idea to get the family together at least one night a week, and that's what he wants to try to maintain.
What was your work-life balance like as PM?
Well,
That's an
not
answer in
great.
itself.
Yeah,
That's
not
an
great.
answer.
Well, look, I was fortunate in this sense, and I guess Lucy and I were fortunate in the sense that by the time I became Prime Minister, our children were well and truly adults. In fact, we were grandparents. So we didn't, I think politics, particularly Canberra politics, is very tough on families because whoever is the politician is away from home a lot of the time, and that's very hard with young kids, particularly because it's putting all the burden on the other spouse. But yeah, look, it's politics particularly at that level is absolutely a full-time job. But I've always, I think you've got to try in any relationship to do as much as you can to invest time in that relationship. It's very easy, particularly when you've got kids.
Yeah.
You've got the pressures of work, demands on your time, kids,
Yeah.
and then how much is left for the parents to actually spend time with each other, and often that gets squeezed out. And I think that's something you've got to try to avoid.
In keeping with politicians who are perhaps trying to do things a little bit differently, I want to talk about Fatima Payman and crossing the floor, because you crossed the floor. It was
on the emissions trading scheme.
yes, and
that's right.
obviously that's different to Labor because the Liberal Party doesn't stipulate or say that you can't, and almost 98% of floor crossings have been from coalition MPs. So, and a few of you then went on to become Prime Minister. William McMahon, John Gorton, Harold Holt. Is it time, do you think, for Labor to have a rethink about this rule? Because it dates back to
yes,
1890.
yes. Look,
Whether Fatima Payman needs to be put in the naughty corner or whether the rule is no longer fit for purpose and suitable for our democracy.
Look, firstly, it's a matter for the Labor Party, naturally. The Labor Party is a very old institution. It's the political wing of the trade union movement, and it's all about solidarity and unity. That's what a union is. It's workers
Collective.
getting together and sticking together, to take on, their employers, the forces of capital, however they describe it. But look, yeah, I think you can't have everybody crossing the floor all the time. Otherwise, you end up without any. You no longer really have a party.
Well, do
But
you think that happens in the Liberal Party?
no, it doesn't. It
Well, so
doesn't.
then it
That's
shows.
my point.
Yeah.
I think it's a very valuable safety valve to have.
Mm.
So, uh, you don't encourage people to cross the floor, but sometimes it's quite helpful. Sometimes you may get a situation where an MP has a particular issue that is red hot in his or her electorate, and it makes sense for them to cross the floor. Differentiation of the individual MP or senator, particularly MP, from the overall party sometimes can be very valuable politically, but then there's also issues of conscience. So I think, I think the problem Labor's got is they've had this rule for 120 years or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
So, but at some point you do have to rethink it, and I suspect they'll no doubt want to wait for the dust to settle after Fatima Payman's floor crossing and departure. But at some point they might be better off having a policy closer to what the coalition has.
What do you think of how she's been treated and her decision represented, both by her party and the press?
Well, she's been criticised for it. I don't know. I haven't sort of scanned it to see whether it's. She's had support. She's had a lot of support. She's had a lot of criticism. That's what you sign up for when you run for Parliament, obviously. Look, I think she's. She's a young senator, but she knows she knows exactly what she's got into, and she's made a decision, a courageous one, a controversial one, and she'll get both support and criticism from it.
Yeah, and perhaps
As you do.
Yeah, and perhaps down the track, the Labor Party reconsidering its position on crossing the floor. I want to turn now to your description of some of your colleagues and also leaders across the seas, because credit to you, you use some very descriptive language. I was wondering if you pull out the thesaurus when you come to describe some of these people. So opposition leader Peter Dutton, you've described as a thug and belligerent. Trump as a bully and a tyrant. Morrison, duplicitous. How would you describe Joe Biden?
Well, in one word, I can't think of one word, but I think Biden has been a good president. He's been a good president. He's an effective political operator, and I think he's done very well. For someone who's always been dismissed as being over the hill and out of touch, he's got a hell of a lot done in his in this term. The reality is his biggest political problem, vulnerability, is his age and the perception that he is not up to doing the job. And so I can absolutely understand why Democrats are very concerned, because if you look at that debate, Biden really unquestionably underperformed there.
Oh, it's a shambles.
And he allowed Trump to get away with,
blatant lies.
Well, that's what Donald Trump does.
Yeah.
This is why one of the reasons why I do these podcast series, and our new one, Defending Democracy on Listener.
Because how can you defend that?
How defend what?
The two leaders, the two options.
That's a terrible option. It's a
terrible options.
Look, the question that everybody is asking is not just what is a second Trump presidency going to be like, and that is a fair question, because at the moment he looks, highly likely to win. Highly likely to win. Not a certainty, nothing is, but highly likely to win. And it's scary. People are scared and frightened by it. And the other question is, and we addressed this in some of the podcasts with some of the Americans, politicians and academics, and how is it that a country of 330 million people has got these two as their candidates for president? I mean, one, Joe Biden, very experienced, let's say he's done a good job, but he is 81 and it's showing.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
is obviously
Yeah.
getting older, sometimes struggles to finish sentences coherently, he looks like a very old man. And on the other hand, you've got Trump, who's only 3 years behind him in age, but who is raging and, threatening and telling lies
Well,
and so
I
forth.
haven't
It's horrible.
I have an answer to that, and I think it just shows that a merit-based system is a fallacy, that people get to where they should be based on their skill and that they deserve it, because surely those two, in a country of 330 million people, can't be the most deserving leaders.
Well, I think you're right, but I think, and look, lack of talent has never been a barrier to high office, right? So we know that. But nonetheless, the American political system has got real problems with it. Their electoral system, gerrymandered congressional districts, um, first past the post voting, voluntary voting, voter
Yes.
suppression. In Australia, as we all know, we have compulsory voting. We get a small fine if you don't vote without a good excuse.
But there's also a whole bunch of things that happen in pre-selections, which means you don't necessarily end up getting candidates that are the most worthy.
That's true, and that's where the next part, the compulsory voting and preferential voting, make a difference. So you look at the last federal election in Australia, look at all those seats seats that had been super safe, larger Liberal seats, where many voters felt the Liberal Party under Morrison had gone too far to the right, and small L Liberal independents, so-called teals, came through the middle and won. I mean, there's only 151 seats, shortly to be 150 again, seats in the House of Reps, and 9 of what had been the Liberal Party's safest seats are now on the crossbench in the hands of smaller Liberal independents, all women, all progressive on climate, and other social issues. They're, and it's a very, very talented group of MPs. I think they're all more likely than not to get re-elected. So, our system has allowed that flexibility. That doesn't exist in America. So I think, we can't be complacent, Antoinette, but,
Yes.
we've got a better
Structure.
electoral system. And you see, a parliamentary system is different too. I mean, if Joe Biden had been elected prime minister in a parliamentary democracy, there is no way he would still be the leader going into this election. His colleagues would have said,
that would have been a
his colleagues
spill.
would have said, "Come on, time for
Yeah.
a younger person."
Yeah.
But it's just so hard. The way their system is set up, unless he decides to pull the pin, he will be the candidate going up against Trump. And as I said, the reality is his biggest liability is his age, and that's one of those things that you can't do anything about. It's not going to improve.
So in your podcast, Defending Democracy, you describe Donald Trump as like the 12-year-old boy who goes to high school for the first time and meets the captain of the football team. That's when he's around Russian President Vladimir Putin. How would you describe Putin as a leader?
Well, he's a tyrant. I mean, he is a tyrant. He's a former KGB officer with all of the ruthless instincts that you get from that line of work. He's a ruthless, tyrannical dictator, and he's consolidated power in and around himself. And, you're seeing that both within Russia and, of course, most shamefully and brutally in the invasion of Ukraine. But that's not the only country he's attacked, of course, but he's the real deal, an absolute dead set dictator.
What about Benjamin Netanyahu?
He is a more complex character, has got plenty of an authoritarian streak, but he's operating in a democracy.
Is it a democracy, though?
Oh, I think yes, it is. It's a really chaotic democracy,
Yeah.
Israel, and with I think, a really unfortunate electoral system. I mean, the Knesset, their parliament, has only one chamber. It has 120 seats, as I recall, and there are no electorates, so it's all elected at large, and so it's essentially by proportional representation. So you get lots of parties, some of them very extreme, and I think what's happened in Israel is the centre of political gravity has moved very much to the right, because it used to, the Labour Party used to be the sort of party of government in Israel if you go back a few decades, but it's moved to the right, and Netanyahu obviously his government relies on the support of some very extreme, right-wing figures like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and that is part of the problem. And obviously there's enormous opposition from many people in Israel. It's I think that it's a nightmare, a complete nightmare.
Some would argue, though, that Israel isn't a democracy and it operates as an ethnocracy, because when you look at Greater Israel, and that includes the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, Palestinians there can't vote. And so it's a democracy for some and authoritarian settlements and occupation for others.
Yeah, well, it depends. I mean, the state of Israel does not include the Palestinian territories and the Palestinians who live in those territories within its polity. There are obviously people who you could describe as Palestinian, who are non-Jewish, Arab, people, depending on how you can describe them, whichever way you like, who are within Israel, live within Israel. They're a minority, and they do have civil rights, but those living in, whether it's Gaza or the West Bank, do not. And you're right. And that's this is the fundamental problem. And we in the West, particularly, we say there should be a two-state solution. Palestinian state of Israel, living side by side in peace. But there is very little support for that any longer within Israel. But the alternative of one state, which includes Palestinians and Jews, is one neither side is supportive of. I wish I knew what the answer was, but I don't, and I think there are people who are much more knowledgeable than me that don't either.
No, I'm not asking. I know I certainly don't think we're going to resolve that conflict in this discussion. But I do note that there's so often much more descriptive and direct language when describing, be it Dutton, thug, or Trump as a bully and a tyrant, and Putin as a tyrant. And then Netanyahu seems to escape the level of criticism that Australian leaders and the US do. We go, oh, he's complex.
I think, Netanyahu is complex, and he
can also be described as a thug and a bully.
Well, yes, he could be. I mean, I've known him for years. He can be very charming. He's very bright. He's operating in a very tough, very, very tough, brutal political environment, and, frankly, strategic environment. I'm not trying to defend him, right?
No,
but
because he's also potentially a war criminal. And I just find the language used around him seems to be, people take a breath, and it's the kind of generosity we don't afford other leaders.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's I think, I don't know that Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu gets plenty of very critical reviews. Leaving aside the issue of allegations of war crimes and military matters, the criticism that so many people in Israel are making, like Gantz, who recently resigned from his cabinet, is that Netanyahu does not have a plan for the day after.
Yeah,
what's next?
Yeah.
Well, what exactly is next? I mean, there are people in his government, like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, whose plan is
they're expanding
to expel the
settlements.
Palestinians. They want the Palestinians to be pushed out. So they are openly advocating ethnic cleansing. Well, Netanyahu has not said that, and the global community would, be in uproar about that.
Mm.
But it is a problem. How do you've got to somehow or other find a way to create a modus vivendi between the two sides, but I fear that they're further apart than ever. And it's so I don't know. What do you think? I mean, what would you do if you were Prime Minister of Israel for a day?
Oh gosh, if I was, and again, I'm not going to purport to be a Middle East conflict expert. I guess I would say that this perception or this rhetoric of eradicating Hamas, I think, is impossible. You're not going to eradicate a resistance force, and you probably have inspired the next generation of more extremists.
Well, the chief of the Israeli Defense Force, I think, has said pretty much exactly that.
So for the first 6 months, we heard eradicate Hamas, we've got to eradicate. That was never going to happen. And as kumbaya as it might sound, nobody is safe and free until everybody is safe and free. And unless people have their dignity on both sides of the border and their autonomy and their human rights, Israel will never be free when they're oppressed neighbours.
Well, you've really got to look at you can't fight terrorism
with terrorism. That's my line.
Yeah, well, that's no doubt, that's right. But you look at the United States with all of its resources, just immense resources, and it was not able to succeed in Afghanistan with all of the resources supporting the Afghan state. It
destroyed the nation and arguably inspired, well, not arguably, the evidence suggests inspired the next wave of terrorism. So it didn't have success.
It is a nightmare. And so this is why getting back to people like Donald Trump.
Yes.
This is why Trump would say or says, and many Americans agree with him, that all of these wars are a terrible distraction. I mean, that nation building is unrealistic, and America should just should not get involved.
Well, that's one thing that I'd probably say I agree with. Not very rarely would I say I agree with Trump.
Well, no, you've got.
But it's an appealing proposition. Theoretically.
I mean, there's no question that the Iraq War was a huge mistake,
and based on an absolute lie.
It was based on whether it was a lie or a misapprehension.
Oh, stop it!
No, I'm not. No, I'm not getting. Listen, I wasn't involved. I'm just saying.
Okay.
I'm just saying that the fact of the matter was that it's terrible. I mean, I think you'd have to say that one of the great foreign policy tragic errors of all time.
Well, we're not going to resolve the Middle East in this chat, unfortunately.
No.
But let's talk again about defending democracy.
Yes.
Because in a world of political donations, huge business interests, political lobbyists, for-profit media, our dear friends who adore us both, Murdoch Press, how can we believe that defending democracy is genuinely possible?
Well, it's absolutely, of course it's possible, and it is, and we're doing it. I mean, it's very important to defend. Well, yeah, of course it is. I mean, democracy is worth fighting for, and we have, you can't give up. You've got to, and I think in this country we're doing pretty well. I mean, again, we must never be complacent.
No.
But we do, and some of we've got big issues with, I think, the sort of extremism or tribalism in some of our media. I think that's a real problem. But I think we are still much more of a reality-based political media culture than in many other countries, not least of which the US.
I would agree that our political system is in much healthier shape than a place like the US, but we have such large levels and concerning levels of media concentration, unparalleled to, as far as I know, to similar Western countries, that the Murdoch influence is just far too great. Like, Do you see that as a significant threat to our democracy?
I think Murdoch's domination of newspapers would be. I can't imagine it. I don't think. I'm not aware of any other
Yeah, I believe
place
it's
in the world where
unparalleled.
it's like 70%
Yeah.
metropolitan newspapers. Having said that, their influence is diminishing because the media pie has grown. You know, there are so many other sources of information, online sources, international. You know, the New York Times, for example, has an enormous readership in Australia. I think more people read the New York Times than read the Australian, for example. That might stand to be corrected there, but when I last looked at some ratings, you know, you look at new entrants like the Guardian. Guardian Australia has got huge readership. And of course you've got all the the social media channels, podcasts, etc. So I think it's a more diverse area. I think the part of the problem is that much of the media, and I think this is much more so with the right-wing media, has become tribal and no longer, wedded to reality. I mean, essentially, it is telling a tribe what it wants to hear.
Yes.
The most terrible, consequential examples, of course, Fox News in the United States. I mean, think about it. Fox News promoted Trump's lie that the 2020 election had been stolen. They promoted that. They promoted and amplified lies, which they knew to be lies, and they did so in order to keep their ratings up, and in that sense added to the context, the environment that enabled that shocking assault, that attempted insurrection on January 6th. Now Murdoch's, we know what I've just said is not, opinion. This is all came out in the emails and discovery in the
trial.
The trial, and the libel trial that was brought against Murdoch, in which they recently settled.
That would mean that public broadcasting is even more important.
It is. I absolutely think it is. Yeah.
Well, then do you have any regrets in your time as Communications Minister or PM? Because under the Coalition, the ABC just continued to face job cuts.
I don't know. I disagree with that. I think the...
What part do you disagree with?
Well, okay. First, a couple of things. I mean, at the time the ABC charter was being renewed, and that was around the time the Coalition came back into government in 2013, News Corp were advocating that the ABC's charter be limited to radio and television and not include online services. And I took a very different approach to that and insisted that be written into the charter, which it is. So you can imagine where the ABC would be if that goal had been achieved. And this, this frankly is one of the problems that one of the things the ABC has got to grapple with is that they allow News Corp to live rent-free in their head. News Corporation has got a commercial agenda,
Absolutely.
which is to undermine and denigrate and criticise and minimise the ABC because they see them as a competitor. Now, you could say they're entitled to say that, but for heaven's sake, don't let that live rent-free in your head, which is what I think the ABC does.
I agree.
Far too much. Now, turning to the ABC's budget, I disagree with the suggestion that, that at least when I was Communications Minister or PM, that we cut the ABC in a way to force job losses. We were endeavouring to cut government expenditure to get the budget back into balance, right? And so everyone had to share some of that pain.
And I will jump in and say two things can be true at once, that the ABC needs to stop allowing News Corp to live rent-free in its head and dictate its decisions, and I've obviously been impacted by one of those decisions, but that also it happened at the same time as, since 2014, $800 million in cuts from the coalition government.
I don't know whether that number's right or
Well,
not.
I mean, that's a number that's been reported by the Guardian and the ABC. And so two things...
I don't know.
Okay, but so these two things happen at the same time, and we talk about defending democracy. I think a robust public broadcaster...
Let me put this to you. the decline in the ABC, I mean, insofar as the ABC's revenues, which is obviously what it gets from the government, declined, and I'm not sure that they declined much, if at all, in absolute terms. But if they did decline, the decline was minute compared to the decline in revenues in the commercial media sectors.
One last question. There's something I hear often. It's particularly when people hear you speak. They enjoy hearing you speak. They enjoy your views. One of the things that I often think as well is, why didn't Mr. Turnbull have all of these convictions necessarily, or strength of opinions when he was PM? How hard is it when you're in the PM?
What convictions are you talking
Well,
about?
just most things that you talk about, it often feels like even your views now, whether it be about nuclear policy, climate change, the Middle East.
I haven't changed my views at all. But nuclear. Nobody seriously suggested Australia should have nuclear power for electricity generation when I was PM, but on the occasions they did, I made exactly the same comments I've made today.
So you don't think that you have to make lots of compromises?
Well, in politics, you have to compromise. It is a parliament, and the political process is about compromise. We don't elect dictators, right? And when people say, "Oh, you're doing deals in the Senate, you're horse trading," yeah, right. That's what it's all set up to do.
So how many of your former colleagues in the coalition do you think are listening to your podcast?
I don't know. I mean, it's rating number one on politics and news podcasts. I imagine a few of them are, but I mean, obviously it only, these ratings are evanescent. I mean, there's new podcasts every day and every week. But yeah, look, I think these are important issues, and I think it's really important for us to understand the fragility of democracy, to understand the threats to it, both locally and globally, and of course, particularly in the context of the US presidential election.
Wonderful. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr.
Well,
Turnbull.
very good. So good to have solved all the problems of the world.
All of it. We did it all in 50 minutes. That's it. Solved.
Okay, see you. Thank you.
That is it for this episode of the Weekend Briefing. It's a place where we have the opportunity to get to know the interesting and influential people behind the headlines. We want to hear from you. Make sure you leave a comment below, like and subscribe. Catch you next week.